Hi, so hard to compete with that. Dude, seriously, you're a kid? All right. I'm going to talk about new forms of association, transparent by design. And yeah, here we go. So crafts are a product of love. You know, my previous political activist self, if you would have asked me, you know, I would start a presentation like that, I would have laughed, but here we are. Crafts, as such, as a product of love, are things we kind of launch head-on, heart first, without really thinking about how we're going to go about sustaining them. And also, as such, they are projects that we mostly do on our free time. And so, at least at the beginning, if we're not when we're starting. And the time that we give to our crafts is time that we want to make sure that it's used in things that matter, right? And not the infrastructure around it. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of crafts and where I'm coming from. This is my friend Gonzalo. We're from Argentina, born and raised in Buenos Aires. And we created a political party in Argentina. And it was a pain in the neck. This is poor Gonza. It wasn't easy. Manually organizing over 18,000 registration cards in alphabetical order, by hand, right? Because that was what the government, or the bureaucracy in Argentina wanted us to do in order to approve our political party. And the problem was that unless we had a proper political party, a proper entity that the government understood it was an organization, we couldn't raise money. So we couldn't campaign, right? Unless, of course, we did all the shady things that we were campaigning against. So essentially, we were stuck with asking the status quo for permission to kind of transform the status quo. And it was a very hard thing to do. We had to jump through all of these hoops in order to have a political party. So we needed to build a command and control hierarchical organization in order to do what we wanted to do. And we were called the net party, like the network party. So command and control hierarchy wasn't exactly, our cup of tea. The second is obviously open source. So I'm going to talk a little bit about open source sustainability, but Luis did a great job, so I'm going to skip most of it. Open source software is not free. Someone else is paying for it. And this is mostly maintainers paying it with their own time, paying for it with their own time. So most of the open source maintainers, again, are doing this in their free time. And we all think that it's super glamorous, but as we heard many, many times today, doing something new, doing new software is not what normally happens. What you do most of the time is maintaining software. So most maintainers are in this situation. This is one of my favorite GitHub accounts. I highly recommend it. It's called Developer Swearing. It's a lot of fun. So maintaining a project is hard work, and this is especially true for the not glamorous parts of open source, maintaining, triaging issues, optimization, etc. So imagine adding to this the legal stuff, accounting, doing the administrative work that our systems expect all of these groups to do in order to have money. When my co-founder at Open Collective, Xavier, was doing Storify, he was building it on Node.js, and this was back in the day, and at the beginnings of Node. So he wanted to give them some money because he thought it was a great software, right? And he was making money out of them, so he's like, I need to give something back. So the problem that Xavier had was he had nowhere to send the money to. Who was doing it? Like a bunch of hackers or coders around the world distributed. One was in Canada, the other one in the United States. There wasn't a Node thing to give money to. And that's part of the problem. And so my approach to sustainability has to do with infrastructure. This is POC21. It's an eco-hacker group that they came together during the climate talks. And they are building software and hardware to tackle climate change. But there are a true distributed community around the world. So when they wanted to receive funding from their larger community, they wanted to give the project after the camp. This was a camp. They wanted to give it some sustainability. they didn't know how to do it. What were they going to do? Do a corporation or a foundation? Where? They were really distributed around the world. It was really hard. So doing the administrative work of setting a legal entity up, and one that, again, had nothing to do with how they operate, was a big headache. So hacking together is great, but going beyond that, how do you do it? You need to create a legal entity. You need to pay for accounting services. You need to name a president or a director. And so these kind of requirements of our operating system, for financial system, it's blocking a lot of initiatives to thrive. There are a lot of ideas that do not grow because of this. This is another example. This is the Enable Fund. It's a global ecosystem of makers, thinkers, artists, etc. They're doing 3D printer for printing for prosthetics. Sorry. And they want to give their the community and the groups around the world a way to have funding, have their own budget to do it. But again, they don't have a way of doing it. They don't have legal entities around the world that are gonna receive this money. So the problem is that our operating system, the operating system that runs our society, is not super familiar with products of love. It's mostly optimized for corporations that compete in a scarcity-driven economy, right? Whether they're for-profit or non-profit, but the only organization that the system understands is the corporation. So it has a president, it has a very hierarchical structure. And that's super out of sync with how networks organize. And so networks, the association of the internet generation, we don't see the world as a zero-sum game. We want to share with one another. We live and breathe open source, right? And so we are kind of pushed to the fringes, or as my friend Alana from Enspiral, and now on my collective, says, we are circles in a world that is made for triangles. So asking our generation to build a command and control hierarchical organization that has a president, that has really complicated transitional, that has a lot of paperwork, is, in my mind at least, the same thing as asking who's the president of the internet. It's equally ridiculous. It's super out of sync with who we are, with the networks. We're going to a highly distributed way of organizing, and yet the only way that we have to organize is super vertical. And not only that, it's very inefficient, right? I bet that every project here, or every civic initiative, or every open source project, every meetup, or if you have that thing that you care about and you want to bring it to life and start trying it, we all go through the same pains, right? Deciding which legal entity we want to use, finding the minimum accounting services that we can get away with, asking ourselves, are we really going to have the money to finance the operational cost before we even start doing what we want to do? So who's going to be taking responsibility in the name of the community? One of the collectives that we work with in Costa Rica, they need to go, three members need to go together to the bank every time because the 3 signatures are required to do things. Right? It's insane. Who's going to be withdrawing money? Who's going to be taking responsibility? So it's the same thing. Having one legal entity per community, per collective, is pretty much the same way as having one server per blog, right? We're all stuck with doing the same repetitive tasks in our own silos, but we can't share the benefits. So what we need is a new operating system that is going to enable people to work together and to use money together without falling into these kind of corporations. It's an operating system that I think it has to be transparent by design. And the reason why it has to be transparent by design is because most of these networks, or many of these communities, have a trust issue. I don't think transparency brings trust. Actually, I think that transparency doesn't build trust, because if you have transparency, you don't need to trust the other person, because it's all out there in the open. But what I do believe is that transparency makes some processes easier in communities where building trust is very hard, because we are distributed and we're not face-to-face, and etc. So we need to build a way where we can all learn from each other, we can iterate, and we can improve over time. And so what we came up with is a new social and economic unit, and we call them open collectives. Right? Open collectives are the associations that we are creating. They're the associations of the internet generation. So creating an association should be as easy as creating a GitHub repository. Right? It should be transparent, so everyone should see the full ledger, and it should also be linked to the project, not the people. Because we give and we contribute to our projects more or less depending where we are at in our lives. I used to run a political party in Argentina. Then I got pregnant and I decided that maybe running for politics wasn't what I wanted to do, right? But I was like the head of the party in paper, so that transition was really complicated, right? We need to find ways where we can contribute more and less and move somewhere else and let other people contribute without that being an administrative headache, because that's really blocking a lot of these projects from growing, our crafts from growing. And so we call them open collectives. So the internet solved very well one problem, well many, but one in particular. That is the problem of collaborating at scale. But when it comes to giving these collectives like a viable financial mechanism, a way of receiving money, and a sustainable organizational structure, we are back talking to lawyers and accountants. We have no way out. And look, I have nothing against lawyers and accountants, especially when they're like Luis, I know. But it's really hard to argue that's where we should put our energy, our focus. The little time that we're giving to our crafts, we shouldn't put it in lawyers and accountants. Collectives are the building blocks of a whole new economy that is emerging in the world, and they need financial mechanisms to be sustainable. Because we need to make sure that our crafts are funded without turning them into hierarchical entities, into entities that we really are not and we don't want to be. So we're shifting to this decentralized way of working, of organizing, of making money, but our economic systems are utterly unable to respond to these new behaviors because they're designed for a different type of economic unit. Great, so how do we do this? So these are our 2 cents to this debate, and it's Open Collective. It's an open source tool for transparent finances. Open Collective enables communities, open source projects, transnational social movements, political parties to collect donations, right? And mobilize volunteers by mutualizing these activities like fiscal sponsorship, bookkeeping, fundraising. What we're doing is we're building the scaffolding for all of this to happen, removing the friction that Luis made a really good point about friction. What we are trying to do is remove the friction of setting up all of these legal entities. So when the collectives, when the communities want to just do what they love, they can just do it without worrying about it. We can share the benefits. So we treat legal entities in the same way that servers are treated. Before, you used to have your server in your own garage. Now you realize that is absurd. So we are all sharing in servers that we just that host content. Legal entities are hosting collectives. So we generate. So we streamline the process of fiscal sponsorship, and each collective can now have a way of receiving funding, managing their own budget, without needing to set up their own legal entity. And what's behind this, what's underneath, it's a network of legal entities that we virtualize. We call them host organizations. So if you have a foundation, for example, you can, or a cooperative, or even a company, or if it's not a lot of money, even if as an individual you can do this, you can start hosting collectives in your own ecosystem. So we mutualize all of these resources for everyone. One of the best cases that we have is the city of Brussels, right? The city in Brussels, there were a lot of, as everywhere in the world really, but there were a lot of separated civic, citizen-led initiatives that were trying to make life in Brussels nicer or better or whatever. And instead of each of them, again, going through the same pains of setting their own legal entity and figuring out this, we just created Brussels together. There's a collective for the city of Brussels. right? So anyone who wants to do something in Brussels, they just become a collective. Brussels Together as an organization takes care of all the boring administrative stuff, and then enables all of these collectives to just be sustainable, to be able to receive funding. And it's absolutely transparent by design. You can see all the money that goes into a collective and out of a collective, you can see it in real time. And we need this for two reasons. A, because to make sure that these communities can operate without needing as much trust. Because again, I don't think transparency builds trust, but certainly makes it easier. And also to enable host organizations to virtualize their legal entities and host all of these collectives. It's a bit like a web browser. What I see what we do is infrastructure. So we essentially connect all of these amazing things that are happening at this level of the stack with a very old, clunky and operating system that is the operating system that runs our economy. So the associations of the internet generation are defined by peer production, their global communities, transparent money flows, and the obsolescence of hierarchy. And this model doesn't only work for open source. It's all of the associations of the internet generation are like this. And especially, I think, we need to be very careful for those in the public interest. This is the ProPublic report on the Red Cross and how they spend the money for the Sandy relief. They spend all the money somewhere else. And the same thing happened with Haiti. There is a big problem. There's a huge report on how the Red Cross used their funding for Haiti. They didn't build what they could have built. So we don't know what that money is going to, right? So especially associations that are in the public benefit need to operate with this level of transparency. Because I think that this case in particular highlights the need to rethink how organizations operate and how we make them more transparent and accountable. So when we find ourselves facing a very clunky, very dated operating system that it's out of sync with how we're really operating in society, I think we have three ways to systemic change. The first one is revolution. That doesn't work very well in general. The second one is changing the system from within. I tried to do that when I was doing politics in Argentina, and it's really hard because, again, it's very hard to expect the status quo to innovate or to transform because there are power dynamics here, right? Those in power want to stay in power. So they have very little incentive to change. And the third model, that is what we are trying to do, is the philosophy behind what we do, is building a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And this is Buckminster's Fuller, very, at least famous phrase, I guess. Some of you might probably know it. But I live by this. I think this is the best way we have to change, to achieve systemic change in society. We need to find ways of building alternative systems, build the bridges with the existing one to make sure that we bring over everyone. But at the end of the day, we need to render the existing one obsolete. It's the only way that we're going to push forward. And obviously, this is Open Collective and everything we do with sustaining open source and sustaining crafts and sustaining our communities. It's a big experiment. And I think that's fantastic. No one has really figured out yet how to kind of unlock decentralized collaboration at scale using money, except the Bitcoin blockchain. But yeah, I don't want to go there. That's another talk. But what we really know for sure is that future will be defined by people who take action, that share costs, that share resources, and that they work together. And we are sort of clashing with an operating system that is forcing us to work in silos. A future where people can choose what they want to work on. The day that my favorite days last year was when one of the author of Webpack, Tobias, quit his job and started working full-time for Webpack, for his community, because of all the funding that they were raising on Open Collective. For me, that was amazing, because that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to work for his open source project, and he wanted to get paid for it. And we helped him get there just by laying out the infrastructure that he needed in order to operate. And so another take on the Fuller's phrase, that is my favorite one. I learned this, again, doing politics, that is, if you can't beat them, abstract them. And just forget about them, because we have to change the world. We don't have time for anything else. So this is us. I'm Pia Mancini on Twitter. Open Collective is Open Collective on Twitter. And that's it for me. Thank you.